What forces a group of 9 seasoned hikers, people who know the unforgiving fury of the Ural Mountains better than anyone, to suddenly slash their tent from the inside and scramble out into a blinding, freezing blizzard wearing nothing but their underwear? This is the haunting, central question that has paralyzed investigators and haunted the public imagination for over 60 years. Imagine the scene. The winds of the Khalat Siak, or the Mountain of the Dead, howling with a demonic intensity, the air so cold it crystallizes your very breath in your throat. Inside the tent, something terrified them. Not a predator, not a storm, but something so urgent, so incomprehensible, that they chose certain death in the freezing darkness over remaining inside their only shelter. They did not retreat in an orderly fashion. They cut their way out with frantic, desperate strokes, leaving behind warm clothes, vital gear, and their only protection against the encroaching frost. Why would they flee into the abyss? Some believe they were driven by a sudden, localized infrasound event, a low-frequency vibration that triggers primal, uncontrollable panic in the human mind. Others suggest a catastrophic avalanche, though the evidence for this remains chillingly thin. Whatever it was, they did not just walk. They ran. And in the silence of that frozen slope, their terror remains perfectly preserved, waiting to be understood. January 27, 1959. The village of Vizhay serves as the final threshold between the known world and the crushing isolation of the Ural Mountains. For the 9 members of the Dyatlov group, this was the last place they would encounter the comforts of civilization. A warm hearth, a radio, and the voices of other human beings. It was here that Igor Dyatlov and his companions checked out, their laughter echoing against the wooden walls of the settlement, unaware that they were stepping toward a date with destiny. But the atmosphere in Vizhay was far from welcoming. Local Mansi hunters and village elders watched the young students with eyes clouded by a deep, ancestral unease. They spoke of the mountain they called Khalat Siak, or the Mountain of the Dead. One local elder reportedly approached the group with a grim warning, cautioning them against trekking into the jagged slopes of the Odortan region. He spoke of ancient spirits, of forbidden ground, and of the malevolent forces that supposedly guarded the mountain peak. The tourists, fueled by the idealistic fervor of Soviet youth, dismissed these warnings as mere folklore and superstition, perhaps even laughing off the chilling gravity in the elder's voice. They saw only a challenge to be conquered, a trail to be blazed. Yet, as they packed their gear and vanished into the biting white void, the heavy silence of the taiga seemed to swallow their trail almost immediately. Looking back at the photographs taken that morning, one cannot help but notice the stark, almost haunting clarity in their eyes. They were walking directly into a trap set by nature, or perhaps something far more sinister, leaving the last vestige of safety behind for a desolate wilderness that would ultimately demand their very souls, leaving behind nothing but questions and the chilling wind that still whispers across the slopes today. The wind across the northern Urals does not merely blow. It howls with a hunger that feels ancient and deliberate. As Igor Dyatlov and his 9 companions ascended the desolate slopes of the Mountain of the Dead, they were moving into a landscape that the local Mansi people have shunned for generations. The name itself carries a weight that the students perhaps dismissed as mere folklore. Yet the atmosphere that evening was heavy with an unnatural stillness. They were exhausted, their legs burning from the climb, but the decision to set up base camp on the exposed mountainside remains one of the most haunting choices in the history of mountaineering. Why choose the open slope, where the biting gusts could rip through canvas, instead of the safety of the tree line just a short distance away? Some researchers suggest they were forced by fading light and the sheer difficulty of navigating the snow-blind terrain in the gathering dark. Others wonder if they were attempting to stick to a rigid schedule, determined to push forward toward the peak regardless of the mounting peril. As they hammered the pegs into the frozen, unforgiving crust of the earth, the twilight bled away into a bruised purple, leaving them isolated in a vast, indifferent wilderness. Little did they know that this patch of desolate ground would soon become their final resting place, a site etched into the annals of tragedy, where the line between reality and nightmare began to blur forever. What could possibly drive 9 experienced hikers to abandon the sanctuary of their shelter in the dead of a sub-zero Ural night, leaving behind their boots, their warm coats, and their only protection against the encroaching frost? As the search party finally crested the windswept slopes, the sight that greeted them felt less like a tragedy and more like a scene from a fever dream. The tent was still there, but it was ruined, shredded from the inside out as if the occupants were desperate to escape a terror lurking mere inches away. Long, jagged tears in the canvas suggested a frantic, almost primal need to reach the outside world. But what were they fleeing? Beyond the mangled nylon, the mountain revealed a haunting breadcrumb trail of footprints. These were not the tracks of people running in panic. They were the rhythmic, measured steps of individuals walking, or perhaps stumbling, down into the tree line. Some prints were made by bare feet, others by socks, pressing deep into the hardening snow. As the wind howled across the pass, it seemed to carry a silent, impossible question. Why would they leave the safety of the tent for a certain, frozen death in the dark? Some theorists suggest an external force, a sudden avalanche or a deafening roar, triggered a collective flight response, yet the tent remained remarkably undisturbed by snow. The trail continues toward the abyss, leading away from warmth, away from survival, and straight into a mystery that has frozen the hearts of investigators for over 60 years. Every step forward was a step toward an unknown, terrifying end. The relentless wind howled across the slopes, sounding almost like a mournful choir echoing through the jagged peaks of the Ural Mountains. It was here, amidst the blinding white expanse of the pass, that the search party finally stumbled upon the grim reality of the disaster. The first bodies were discovered not in the comfort of a shelter, but scattered across the frozen earth like broken dolls discarded by a cruel hand. What the searchers saw would haunt their nightmares for the rest of their lives. Two of the hikers lay near the remnants of a small fire under a towering cedar tree, their flesh exposed to the biting, sub-zero cold. They were dressed only in their underwear, stripped of the heavy winter gear that might have offered a sliver of protection against the lethal frost. The sight was deeply unsettling, a visceral testament to a panic that defied all rational explanation. Why would experienced trekkers, trained in the brutal realities of the winter, abandon their warmth in the dead of night? Some believe they were fleeing an immediate, terrifying threat that breached their sanctuary, forcing them to prioritize desperate escape over survival gear. The silence of the mountain held the truth, yet as the searchers gazed at the lifeless forms, only questions remained. The victims seemed caught in a final, frantic struggle against an unseen enemy, leaving their gear behind as if every second mattered more than their very lives. The air itself felt heavy with the weight of that unfinished story, a chilling tableau of mystery etched deep into the ancient snow. You have to wonder, when the bodies were finally recovered from the frozen slopes, what kind of force could reduce a human frame to such ruin without leaving a single trace on the surface? This is where the medical reports stop being merely clinical and begin to veer into the realm of the impossible. Dr. Boris, the pathologist tasked with the autopsy, was faced with injuries that defied every conventional explanation of trauma. 3 of the hikers, Dubinina, Zolotaryov, and Kolvatov, suffered catastrophic internal damage that would usually be associated with a high-speed vehicle collision or falling from a significant height onto solid stone. Yet, their chests were crushed, their ribs shattered in a complex, multifocal pattern, and their hearts suffered severe contusions. Here is the haunting detail that chills the blood of every investigator. There was an utter absence of external bruising. The skin remained pristine, supple, and unbroken. How can the human ribcage cave inward under immense mechanical pressure without leaving a single purple welt, a graze, or a tear on the surface of the body? Some speculate that a shockwave from an experimental aerial blast could cause such internal crushing, while others suggest a freak geological phenomenon, a localized tremor of unimaginable violence. But neither theory explains why the external tissue remained perfectly untouched. It is as if an invisible, crushing weight pressed down upon them for a split second, bending bone until it splintered, yet refusing to bruise the flesh that lay beneath. Was it a physical blow, or something far more esoteric, a silent force that bypasses the skin to shatter the soul of the body from within? We are left staring at the autopsy logs, knowing that the laws of physics as we understand them simply do not account for such silent, brutal precision. Could a simple piece of fabric hold the key to the ultimate annihilation of 9 experienced hikers? As the investigation into the incident deepened, forensic examiners made a discovery that shifted the narrative from a tragic accident to something far more sinister and baffling. Among the various pieces of evidence gathered from the wreckage of the camp and the bodies themselves, investigators detected abnormal levels of radiation on several garments. When the clothes were subjected to rigorous testing, the results sent a chill through the authorities. Certain items of clothing, particularly those worn by Zolotaryov and Dubinina, showed levels of contamination that were significantly higher than what should have been present in such a remote, mountainous region. This was not the faint, natural background radiation of the Ural wilderness. This was a concentrated, anomalous signature. Some researchers have pointed to the proximity of secret nuclear testing sites or the possibility of radioactive fallout from a failed weapons experiment, suggesting the group may have inadvertently wandered into a hazardous zone where something went terribly wrong. Others argue that this radiation was merely a byproduct of the victims' own professional backgrounds in the nuclear industry, claiming the contamination followed them from their workplaces. Yet, if the contamination was already present, why were the levels so concentrated, and why did they appear so sporadically? The presence of these invisible particles turns the entire tragedy into a haunting puzzle, casting a shadow of doubt over every official explanation. Was it a coincidence, or did the group stumble upon a forbidden secret that eventually cost them their lives? The mountain was no longer just a landscape. It had become a frozen tomb, indifferent to the lives it had claimed. By early May, the melting snows began to reveal the final, harrowing secrets of the group. Deep within a ravine, buried beneath 4 meters of compacted, icy powder, lay the remaining 4 hikers. This was a place of shadows, a natural depression where the wind howled like a wounded beast, concealing the truth from even the most persistent searchers. When the recovery teams finally dug through that oppressive weight of white, they were met with a scene that defied all logic. These 4, unlike their companions found near the cedar, had sought shelter in the deep crevice of the creek bed, perhaps hoping the earth would provide a barrier against the freezing gale. But the earth turned against them. They were found tangled in an unnatural embrace with nature, their bodies broken by forces that investigators struggled to categorize. Some believe they were crushed by a sudden, massive collapse of the snowdrift, while others point to the internal injuries, severe chest trauma akin to a high-speed collision, as proof of an event far more violent than a simple slide. Their faces, once filled with the warmth of youthful ambition, were now masks of silent, permanent agony. As the rescuers pulled them from the depths, the silence of the Ural Mountains seemed to deepen, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, guarding the memory of what truly transpired in that hollowed-out grave. The discovery of these last 4 did not provide the closure everyone prayed for. Instead, it only deepened the darkness of the mystery, leaving behind more questions than the ice could ever answer. The silence of the Ural Mountains is heavy, but it feels particularly suffocating when we gaze upon the remains of the hikers. Among the most gruesome discoveries made weeks after the initial search were the injuries sustained by Ludmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov. When their bodies were finally pulled from the snow-covered ravine, investigators were met with a sight that defied conventional explanation. Both victims were missing their eyes, and in the case of Dubinina, her tongue had been cleanly removed. For decades, this detail has served as the fuel for the darkest theories surrounding that night. Some skeptics point to the natural process of decomposition and the cold, unyielding nature of the mountain environment. They argue that the bodies, lying face down in a small stream for months, were scavenged by local fauna. The soft tissues, such as the tongue and the moist lining of the eyes, are the first targets for small animals and birds that populate these frozen slopes. It is a grim, biological reality. Yet, this prosaic explanation fails to satisfy those who look at the clinical precision of these wounds. One theory suggests that the removal was too surgical, lacking the characteristic tearing of animal predation. Was this an act of sheer malice, a ritualistic marking, or perhaps something even more unfathomable? We are left to wonder if these scars were the final, silent witnesses to a horror that the official reports dared not name. Was it nature, or did something else reach into the dark, leaving behind a void that no forensic science has yet been able to fully fill? The truth remains buried under the weight of the snow. Have you ever stood beneath a sky so vast and empty that it felt as if something was watching you from the velvet abyss above? On that cursed night in February, 1959, while the wind howled like a wounded beast around the slopes of the mountain, the 9 hikers were not the only ones witnessing the heavens. Miles away, other groups and local observers reported something that defies all rational explanation. Massive, glowing orange spheres drifting silently across the firmament. These were not meteors, and they certainly were not airplanes. Witnesses described them as luminous orbs, pulsating with an eerie, rhythmic light, casting a sickly golden hue over the snow-covered wilderness. Some believe these objects were high-altitude test rockets, stray remnants of a clandestine military exercise gone wrong, perhaps dumping toxic fuel or malfunctioning in the thin, biting air. Others, however, point to the strange, unnatural stillness that accompanied these sightings, a silence so profound it felt heavy, pressing against the eardrums like a physical weight. The reports are consistent, chillingly precise, and impossible to simply dismiss as mass hysteria. Could these wandering lights have been the silent sentinels of the tragedy, or perhaps the very catalyst that forced the hikers out of their tents into the freezing death trap? The sky held a secret that night, a glowing enigma that vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind a haunting trail of questions that still flicker in the dark corners of history. Could a sudden, invisible force of nature have turned the slope into a tomb? As we delve deeper into the night of the tragedy, many researchers have turned their gaze toward the theory of a katabatic wind. These are not merely gusts. They are violent, gravity-driven currents of cold air that plunge down mountain slopes with terrifying velocity. On that fateful night, some experts suggest that a localized, powerful wind, a phenomenon common to the harsh northern Urals, could have acted as the primary catalyst for disaster. Imagine the scene. The 9 hikers were camped on a slope that was technically far too exposed for their own safety. If a katabatic event struck, it would not just howl. It would exert immense, suffocating pressure on the thin fabric of their tent. Some meteorologists argue that this atmospheric anomaly could have triggered a localized slab avalanche, a rare but lethal release of snow that does not require a massive storm to initiate. In this version of events, the crushing weight of the snowpack might have forced the group to slash their way out of the tent in a desperate, panic-stricken frenzy, fleeing into the freezing dark with insufficient clothing. It presents a haunting possibility that the mountain did not just fail them, but that the very air around them turned into a weapon, silent and sudden, leaving them exposed to a cold that offered no mercy. But if it was just nature fury, why do the patterns of their retreat feel so calculated, so strangely frantic, and yet so inexplicable? The wind might explain the initial terror, but it leaves us wandering through the darkness of their final choices. Could a simple trekking expedition have accidentally crossed the path of a clandestine experiment? This is perhaps the most chilling theory surrounding the incident, one that shifts our gaze from the natural elements to the unseen hand of the state. Many researchers have pointed to the strange, glowing spheres reported by locals and other hikers in the region during February 1959. Some believe these were not paranormal entities, but rather the visible signatures of top-secret rocket fuel tests conducted by the military. Proponents of this theory suggest that the group may have been exposed to toxic, volatile chemicals during a failed missile launch. If a rocket malfunctioned overhead, the resulting fallout could have blanketed the camp, causing severe skin irritation, disorientation, and perhaps even the internal hemorrhaging documented by the medical examiners. The presence of unnatural, high concentrations of radioactive isotopes found on some of the victims' clothing has fueled this fire for decades. Critics, however, argue that the levels were too low to be lethal. Yet the mystery remains. Why were the searchers instructed to sign non-disclosure agreements regarding their findings? Were they protecting the sanctity of the investigation, or were they scrubbing evidence of a catastrophic military error? The desertion of the tent, in such a desperate, panicked fashion, could be explained by a sudden, invisible toxic threat that forced the group out into the freezing night, leaving them blind and delirious before the mountain finally claimed them. We are left to wonder if the truth is buried not under the snow, but in archives that remain sealed to this day. Imagine standing on the desolate, wind-whipped slopes of the Ural Mountains in the dead of a freezing February night. The air is deathly still, yet your skin crawls with an irrational, primal terror that you cannot explain. You are not alone, but there is nothing to see. This is the chilling reality of the infrasound hypothesis, a theory that suggests the tragedy was not caused by human malice, but by an invisible physical phenomenon. Infrasound consists of low-frequency sound waves, below 20 Hz, which are completely inaudible to the human ear. However, the human body is sensitive to these vibrations. When wind rushes over the jagged, harsh terrain of the mountain, it can create a phenomenon known as the vortex street, generating powerful, localized pulses of infrasound. Some researchers argue that as these waves intensified, they bypassed the tourists' conscious perception and struck directly at their nervous systems. This is not just a theory of discomfort. It is a theory of biological upheaval. Prolonged exposure to such frequencies is known to induce severe physiological effects, ranging from intense nausea and dizziness to acute, paralyzing panic and even terrifying, vivid hallucinations. In this state of cognitive breakdown, the boundary between reality and nightmare dissolves, perhaps forcing 9 experienced hikers to slash their own tent and flee into the blinding, sub-zero void, desperate to escape an enemy that existed only within their own fractured minds. The timeline of that final night on the mountain remains the jagged edge upon which every official theory eventually bleeds out. When we examine the forensic recovery of the group, the chronological discrepancies become impossible to ignore. Investigators initially claimed the group perished on the night of February 1st, yet everything about the scene, from the state of the half-eaten meals to the physiological decomposition of the bodies, suggests a much wider gap in time. Some independent researchers point to the curious state of the victims' lungs and internal organs, arguing that certain biological markers suggest they survived far longer than the official report claims. This brings us to the chilling prospect of a botched cover-up. Why were the families told their loved ones died of hypothermia before the autopsies were even completed? Why were the documents marked with top-secret stamps, sequestering them in regional archives for decades? One theory suggests that the authorities were not hiding an alien encounter or a supernatural beast, but rather a catastrophic military test that went horribly wrong. If a rocket or chemical experiment had inadvertently struck the mountainside, a hasty cleanup operation could explain the missing logbooks, the radio silence, and the terrifying inconsistencies in the death certificates. Was the search party delayed on purpose to allow the military to sanitize the site of evidence that would have implicated the state? We are left staring at a narrative that was clearly rewritten in real time, leaving us to wonder if the truth is not buried under the snow, but hidden behind the heavy iron doors of bureaucracy. Imagine reading a diary written by someone who is already technically a ghost, yet seeing nothing but the mundane optimism of a student hiking trip. This is the haunting dissonance of the files. As we pore over the recovered journals, the entries remain maddeningly, almost cruelly normal. There are no frantic scribbles, no warnings of strange lights, no mention of shadows stalking the perimeters of their tents. Igor Dyatlov writes of the weather, the weight of their packs, and the light-hearted jokes shared around the campfire. Zinaida Kalmogorova details the logistics of their route, displaying the sharp, pragmatic mind of an experienced climber. They talk about their health, the quality of their food, and the anticipation of reaching their destination. It is a narrative of absolute normalcy, meticulously preserved until the very last moment. Why does the record stop so abruptly, leaving us with a blank page that screams of a sudden, violent interruption? Some believe the group simply did not have the time to document a threat so fast and alien that it defied human comprehension. Others suggest that the diaries were sanitized by authorities, stripping away any mention of something truly terrifying to preserve the image of national resilience. But as you scan those brittle, handwritten lines, you cannot help but feel the weight of what is missing. The lack of clues is the loudest evidence of all. It implies that when the horror arrived, it arrived without a prelude, turning a group of ambitious, vibrant explorers into victims of a mystery that neither science nor history has managed to fully strip of its shroud. They were walking toward their own vanishing point, and they did not even know it. What if the true horror of the past was not something we could ever capture on camera or document in a formal report? We have combed through the autopsy sketches, analyzed the radiation levels on their sweaters, and scrutinized the strange, orange glow reported by observers that night, yet the mountain remains stubbornly silent. The Mountain of the Dead has not yielded a single definitive answer in over 60 years. Some believe the group stumbled upon a secret military test, a kinetic energy weapon that tore through the fabric of their tent, while others cling to the chilling theory of a localized infrasound phenomenon, a natural roar that drove them into a state of panic-induced madness. Yet, these explanations feel like cold, sterile bandages applied to an open, festering wound of mystery. When you look at the final photographs, those grainy glimpses of shadows in the snow, you are not just looking at a tragedy. You are staring into the abyss of human vulnerability. The wind still howls across that desolate ridge, carrying the echoes of 9 hikers who stepped out into the night and never returned to the warmth of the living. The Mountain of the Dead keeps its secrets, leaving us with nothing but a haunting reminder of how fragile our reality truly is, and how easily a single moment can transform a journey into a legend that refuses to die. The mystery persists, forever locked in the ice of the Ural Mountains, waiting for the truth to be unearthed from the silence.